so you can upload it there. Are you okay if we upload the talk afterwards, Professor?
Yeah, definitely.
Verbič?
Yeah. Not
okay.
a problem.
Okay. So, well, thank you everybody for joining today. Our talk today is a little bit off the usual schedule because Professor Verbič is coming, talking to us from Australia. Where it's at 9 in the morning right now, so we're taking one in our later afternoon. The talk today, Professor Verbič is going to talk to us about his research on distributed energy resources integration into low and medium voltage networks. The Professor Verbič is a professor in the University of Sydney, and today we're interested in hearing from him topics related to peer-to-peer transactions and how to orchestrate response of several users in the energy management problem and at the distribution level. So thank you, Professor Verbič, for joining us today on the talk, and take it away.
Thank you, Jose. Maybe I have to correct you. I'm not a full professor yet. I'm associate professor, which is equivalent to tenured professor in the US, but I did apply for promotion this year, so fingers crossed. Or maybe you know something I don't know yet.
This is the Recorder for Prosperity. It's just like a forward-looking naming. So when people look at the several years from now on YouTube, they can be like, "Oh, that's Professor Verbič." So it's like it's in advance.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for hosting me. So it's my pleasure to be with you today, and my talk today will be about aggregation of distributed energy resources, and the subtitle is From Theory to Practice. So my aim is to show what the academia is currently doing and where the industry is currently at that space. And I have to acknowledge the fact that my talk is very Australian centric, even though I guess the lessons from Australia are applicable globally. So I guess we are all heading in that direction, but maybe we are a little bit ahead in that evolution to a more decentralized power system. So I would also like to acknowledge the contribution of my co-authors, Jason, Daniel, Iju, Sleman, and Archie, who are past PhD students and postdocs. Okay, so that's the agenda for today. I'll talk about the background and motivation, and then I'll give an overview of management and coordination approaches for DER, distributed energy resources. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the various approaches, and then I'll step back and give a perspective from the industry and look at where the industry is currently at and what are the open challenges. And most of the talk is based on this paper, which we published a couple of years ago in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews. So if you're interested in that, you can read that paper. The paper also includes at the end an overview of current trials. So that's, if you're interested in what is currently happening in the industry, that's a useful resource. Okay, so I like to start this talk with a bit of a historical, stepping back in time. This is from 2013. I like to start the talk with what the CSIRO is basically a national lab in Australia, similar to what you have in the US. And they convened in an industry forum. So they invited people from various sectors of the industry to come up with predictions of how the evolution of power systems might look like. And they came up with 4 scenarios. So I'll briefly mention them. The first one is set and forget, which is pretty much business as usual, still relying on centralized generation. There's a little bit of demand side technologies, but everything is still centralized control. Then on the opposite end, we have a renewable stripe scenario where you can see here at the bottom, so that the system will pretty much rely on renewables, but those renewables will be large scale. So all utility scale renewables, basically mimicking the existing conventional centralized model. Then there are 2 scenarios that anticipated a much bigger penetration of demand side resources. And the first one is a bit of a pessimistic scenario where the system operators and the policy doesn't really adopt to that new reality. So people then simply decide to leave the grid. And the notion is that behind the meter distributed energy resources will be so cheap that people leave the grid, but that's really not an optimal scenario. And then the last one, they call it rise of the prosumer, where they realize that distributed energy resources, in particular behind the meter distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, batteries, electric vehicles, will become so cheap that customers will become prosumers. So they will be also able to generate, produce power, not just consume power. And the role of centralized power will decline considerably. And they also anticipated that the level of control will shift from the center to the edges of the grid. So prosumers will take control of their own energy usage. And the network becomes a platform of a transaction. So I find this quite visionary. This was now almost 10 years ago. And the situation we are witnessing now in Australia is probably somewhere between renewable strive and this rise of the prosumer scenario, although leaning more towards the latter. I will show you some pictures later on to illustrate that. So what happened after 2013? The technology cost is still dropping. So on the left, we have capital cost for rooftop solar. We are currently somewhere here. So we see that this will still drop considerably in the future. And the same can be said for residential batteries. On top of that, we have new business models. So the important thing here is that at the moment, behind the meter distributed energy resources are pretty much used for self-consumption and maybe some price arbitrage. So for example, if you have a time of use tariff, you can charge the battery when the electricity price is low and then discharge when that's high. But this is not quite, so the revenue you can make from that, the value of that, it's not quite sufficient to overcome the cost of the battery. And this is like the range. So the cost is somewhere between here and here. But now new opportunities are coming up as virtual power plants and network services. So when you add value, so when you harness those additional value streams, now distributed energy resources, the value of distributed energy resources becomes bigger than the initial cost. And this is driving the uptake of DRs even further. And on top of that, we have digitalization of the energy landscape. It's interesting to look at this graph at the bottom, where this is global investment in digital electricity infrastructure compared to some other industries, for example, global power, gas power generation, Indian power sector, or I don't know, video games. And you can see that the message from this slide is that power utilities are investing huge amounts of money into digitalization of the infrastructure, which drives all of that I mentioned before, the uptake of DR even further. So as a result of that, this is the projection again from the CSIRO, our national lab, the projection of small scale embedded technologies, which is only a couple of years, even not that much old. You can see that this is projected capacity of rooftop solar and residential batteries, and this is projected to grow quite strongly well into the future. So where is all of that taking us? This is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance from 2017, and EMO and Energy Networks Australia referred to that in their Open Energy Networks discussion paper. So they predicted that by late 2030s, the rate of decentralization in Australia will reach 45%. So that means that 45% of the total installed capacity in the system will sit behind the meter, like in residential homes, maybe small commercial buildings, mostly in the form of rooftop solar and batteries, but also electric vehicles. So what it means is that electric power systems will become increasingly centralized. So I illustrated that in this diagram. So on the left, we have a single line diagram of a typical power system. See here we have the transmission level, then a medium voltage distribution, and that low voltage distribution. And schematically, this can be represented using this like picture on the right. It's a bit simplified, but I guess the message I'm trying to get across using this picture is that the power flow is from the center to the edges. Now, with the increasing penetration of distributed energy resources, so you can see that now we have batteries and rooftop solar being installed at the low voltage level. Now the power becomes increasingly two-way. Because prosumers can now also generate power. Now, the issue with that is, and this is now what we are witnessing in Australia, in some states, Queensland and South Australia in particular, this is quite a big issue. As you increase the penetration of behind the meter DERs, you get network problems. And this typically happens in the middle of the day with a lot of sunshine and little demand. When all those PV systems generate power and send it to the grid, the voltages get too high, and that becomes a problem. To the extent that utilities have started openly talking about basically charging customers for exporting power to the grid, which is obviously not in anyone's interest. On the other hand, Australian Energy Market Commission, AEMC, so they are the rule makers. They realized that that's not really the right way to do it, and they came up with plans to do something about it, to basically make room for rooftop solar and batteries. And they also recognize the fact that DRs can be actually providers of system services. So that's now where this policy framework is heading. Okay, so so far, the issue, I mean, the focus was on hosting capacity. So how to enable people to connect more and more DRs at the distribution level. But now we are heading into the future where we increasingly recognize that DRs have to be actively integrated, and they can actually do something useful for the network. So to illustrate that, that's the situation in South Australia. So this is just one state on the eastern seaboard of Australia. This is from October, late October, early November last year. So that's spring, lots of sunshine, mild temperatures. And you can see, so this is the situation in South Australia. The total demand is about 1.4 gigawatts, relatively small system, but still not as small by any means. So small compared to a maybe larger interconnection. So the total installed capacity in the national electricity market spanning the eastern seaboard of Australia from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania is roughly 35 gigawatts. So South Australia is small by comparison, but still a big system. And it's connected to the rest of the national electricity market through one transmission line to Victoria. So if we look at what's happening on a typical spring day in South Australia, and I didn't really have to cherry pick. So this is pretty much, if you open, this is from OpenNAM. I don't have it here. If you're interested, so there is a web page, OpenNAM. If you just open it, you don't have to be very, you don't have to cherry pick to basically find a situation that looks for something like that. So what I'm showing here is that this yellow, bright yellow is rooftop solar. This dark yellow is utility scale solar. Green is wind. This is import from Victoria, and this orange, that's gas-fired generation that is still required to maintain inertia. Otherwise, you can see that like here, all the energy comes from non-synchronous resources, and that's another issue in South Australia. That's a topic for another discussion. But because there is so much non-synchronous generation, they need to run a couple of gas turbines to provide inertia, and they are increasingly being, so they are now actively trialing, and even some batteries with grid forming capabilities are already in operation, and that's projected to replace gas-fired generation in the future. Anyway, so what I'm showing here is that South Australia is already in a situation where most of the power comes from renewable, and distributed behind the meter resources are a prominent player. And it happened not maybe in this slide, but it already happened that all of the energy, all of the power required in South Australia was coming from behind the meter DR. So I guess that's in the global stage quite extraordinary. Okay, so now when you realize that you have so much capacity resources sitting behind the meter that they can actually do something good for the networks, and the question is how to actively integrate them. So here I'm illustrating that using a simulation that is roughly inspired by the NEM, the situation in the NEM, but it's just for illustration purposes. So what happens when you increase the penetration of rooftop solar and or solar in general and wind? Wind now is blue. So this is, here is wind, gas. So this is gas, open cycle gas and combined cycle gas. So this, here, when you increase the penetration of renewables, you basically push coal. So this is brown coal, black coal. You push it out of the market. But the important thing is that you need a lot of gas in the afternoon to provide flexibility. Now, that's really not an optimal outcome. It's definitely not helpful when you want to fully decarbonize the system. What you can do instead, you can use behind the meter distributed energy resources to provide flexibility. So now when you do that, you can see that now, and by the way, I didn't mention that, so maybe go back to here. So the red line is inflexible demand in the system. This is total demand in the system. And the difference between red and blue, this is flexible demand for prosumers. So this is basically prosumers. So this gap here is coming from rooftop solar. So this is rooftop solar. Rooftop PV. So now what you can do, if all these rooftop systems are equipped with batteries, they can charge when there is plenty of renewable generation available in the wholesale system, and then discharge in the evening. So that's what's happening. If I increase the penetration of batteries, you can see that in the middle of the day, prosumers start to soak up power, which then significantly diminishes the need for gas-fired generation in the evening. So if you are interested in how we did that, we use the methodology proposed in this paper, which effectively assumes that all distributed energy resources are actively coordinated, and we model that using a generic demand model. So all the details are available in this paper. So this goes to show that with increasing penetration of DERs, they can actually provide valuable network services. But in order to do that, you have to actively manage and coordinate them. So now this brings me to the question of how you actually do that, what needs to be done at a market and policy level to make this happen. So moving from a deregulated environment, this is a typical situation in most jurisdictions today, into a deregulated environment with prosumers. So the first thing of the electricity flow now becomes two-way, as I illustrated before. So the electricity can also flow upstream, and this is what's happening in Australia, in South Australia, where there is so much PV generation available in the low voltage level. But if you want to actively aggregate distributed energy resources, you need a new entity, which is called an aggregator. And those aggregators can then coordinate DRs so that they can provide support services to the grid. The financial flow is now, well, obviously still from customers to the retailers, but also prosumers can earn additional, so harness additional value streams, so can make money by providing services to the bulk grid. And importantly, you need coordination between the DSO and the retailer to avoid network problems at low voltage levels. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so now this brings me to a schematic overview or categorization of different DR approaches, which we describe in this paper. And we categorized DR approaches based on 3 different metrics. So the first matrix is system oriented. So basically, so this is basically the y-axis. They can be fully system oriented, so they only look at the benefit of the system, or they can be fully customer oriented, so only looking at the benefit of DR owners, so the prosumers. And then so that's the first metric. The second metric is network awareness. They can be completely network oblivious. They completely disregard what is the impact of power flows on the operation of low voltage, also medium voltage and high voltage, mostly low voltage and medium voltage networks, or they can be fully network aware. So this DR aggregation is done by taking full account of the impact on the network. So the different classes or types of DR coordination approaches are, first of all, home energy management. So this is completely customer oriented, and I'll describe them in a little bit more detail later. Completely focused on the benefit of the customer, and they completely neglect the impact on the network. And as I mentioned, this is now becoming an issue. So distribution network service providers or distribution system operators have now come up with this thing called operating envelopes, which is basically an export limit. They send this export limit to the customer, so they can only optimize within the limits that take into account the impact on the network. So when you do that, then this approach becomes more network aware, but is still very much customer oriented. Now then we have peer-to-peer energy trading, which is a bit of an outlier, but I do mention it because it's being used and trialed in many parts of the world. So this sits somewhere in between, depending on how you take network impacts into account. And then you have like a full-fledged DR integration, either as virtual power plants. Now I put them in the top right corner because the current version of VPPs are very much system-oriented and they are network oblivious. And finally, we have network-aware virtual power plants that coordinate DRs using an optimal power flow, so which means that they are by definition fully network aware, but if you only take into account the benefit of the system, they are completely system oriented. Okay, so I'll start with home energy management. So I have a few slides, but I won't really dwell on that for too long. What I will mention is that this home energy management essentially stems from the need to coordinate distributed energy resources sitting in residential homes, maybe small commercial premises. At the moment, batteries and PV systems are the most common one. You can also add to that fuel cells, electric vehicles, basically any device, or flexible loads, any device you can control. And the main objective of this DR management is to reduce the electricity bill or increase PV self-consumption, which is in some settings equivalent, or you can also improve comfort. that home energy management can be formulated as an optimization problem where you essentially minimize some cost function, either cost or maximize PV self-consumption. This can be described as a decision-making process under uncertainty, which can be solved using different approaches. So, for example, we have in this paper, we proposed an approximate dynamic programming approach. We also used other approaches. We tried reinforcement learning, also mathematical programming. Now, in this paper, where we compared the different approaches, which I won't have the time to talk about in this paper, but if you're interested. So in this paper, we modeled the home management problem as a linear programming problem. Now, the interesting thing is here that we proposed a fully linear formulation without any integer variables. And this is made possible by the fact that, skip to that, that the grid supply charge, or the tariff, the price for electricity you pay where you take power from the grid, is always bigger than the amount of money you get paid when you send power into the grid. And that allows us to split this power flow between the grid and the customer, to split it into two variables. One, when the power flows in one direction, the other one when the power flows in the other direction. And because of that convex shape of the cost function, it can never happen. It will always happen, then one of them will be zero. And that's why you don't need integer variables. Now, I won't really dwell on that. It's not important in the context of my talk. What I will mention is that there are several companies offering devices that can actually do this home energy management to coordinate different resources. So Reposit is one company, SwitchDin is another one. It's a simple device. You can connect it close to the smart meter, and they use different versions of this home management, different optimization approaches for DR coordination. I won't really talk about that because it's not the main focus of this talk. Okay, so I did mention, so I will also mention peer-to-peer energy trading. There's more details provided in this paper, and there are references to other papers where we proposed also a network permission structure to make sure that peer-to-peer energy transactions don't cause network problems. But peer-to-peer energy trading, essentially, the idea is to allow DER owners or prosumers to trade power among themselves. So essentially, you have a part of the network, maybe a low voltage network, where you can organize a peer-to-peer market. And the whole idea is for the prosumers to get better value for the power they export into the grid. So the neighboring customers who don't have PV can buy that power, and the money the PV owners earn by doing that is more than what they would get if they simply send power to the grid. Now, given the current state of the art on many systems globally, that's a perfectly viable approach. It's a good way to extract better value from DERs. But in the bigger scheme of things, I would say is a bit of a dead end, because doesn't really allow you to scale that peer-to-peer approach to harness DERs on a larger scale. So that's why I won't really dwell too much on peer-to-peer energy trading. So essentially, if you're interested, if you've never heard about this before, essentially, there are several approaches. One is multi-bilateral economic dispatch, which basically mimics economic dispatch in the wholesale market. And then you have auction-based approaches, either using continuous double auction or stable matching algorithm. So the idea is that every customer in the network can trade power or energy with any other customer in the network. So you have a set of buyers, set of sellers, each with its own utility function. So the utility is the difference between the benefit. So this is what customer benefit from buying power from the grid, and how much it costs them, right? So when the difference is positive, then they gain utility. And the same can be said for the sellers. So that's the difference between the money they make in the market by selling energy and the cost of producing that power. So you can organize that as an auction. You need an auctioneer, but this can be made fully distributed. You can use a distributed ledger, so it doesn't require a central utility. Okay, so now the next step in the evolution of DR integration are so-called virtual power plants. The idea is to aggregate DRs in different parts of the network and to turn them into a pretty much dispatchable resource that can be used in the market in pretty much the same way as you use other dispatchable conventional resources. And for that, you have to orchestrate or coordinate DRs, and for that you need a VPP controller. So that's the idea. Now, how to do that? You can formulate that as an optimization problem. So looking at the market structure I mentioned before, so you have here at the bottom, you have prosumers or user agents. Then you have DR aggregator in the middle, and on top of that, you have the distribution system operator who makes sure that network constraints are not violated. Now you can cast that as an optimization problem where you minimize some cost function, and the decision variables include decision variables of the user agents, the DSO, and the aggregator. So now that's conceptually like a canonical DR coordination problem formulation. And now I will talk a little bit about different versions, how you actually make this work. The first one is a so-called system-focused VPP, and I call this VPP 1.0. 1.0 because that's pretty much where the industry is currently at. So they're maybe even one step behind and don't really use a principled optimization, but it's close to that. So now what you do, you can think of that the DR aggregator is also a retailer who wants to minimize the exposure in the wholesale market. So essentially what I do, so they minimize their cost function, and that cost function in this paper, we assumed a quadratic cost function, which mimics the cost of power in wholesale markets. And this VPP aggregator uses prosumer-owned resources batteries. Pretty much, they assume that they are fully controllable. So they use DER, prosumer-owned DER, to minimize the cost in the wholesale market. And as I said, that that's how they do it. So to minimize the exposure in the wholesale market. So for example, when they anticipate that the price of electricity in the wholesale market will be high, they pre-charge batteries in anticipation of that. And when the peak price period arrives, they discharge batteries to avoid purchasing electricity in the wholesale market at a high cost. And again, that assumes full control, direct control of prosumer-owned batteries. Now, this is formulated as a multi-period optimization problem, and you can solve it in basically in a rolling horizon approach akin to model predictive control. Now, note here that there is no notion of customer benefit. So you can add to that. So you add also the customer cost, which is the objective function from the home energy management problem I mentioned before. This is self-consumption maximization, and then you can weigh the two to put more or less emphasis on one or the other. And this is called I call this customer focus, because you also have this explicit customer benefit in the objective, but otherwise the approach is the same. Now, you might ask, well, what happens if you have potentially tens of thousands of customers? How you solve that centrally? Well, you can't, and that's why you need to solve that in a distributed fashion. Now, I'm not aware of anyone actually doing that, but it's important to explain that as a stepping stone to something that actually has been done in practice. So the way you solve this, you basically solve this in a distributed approach. You have so first of all, you form the Lagrangian. Well, this is actually partial Lagrangian, because you only relax the power balance constraint. You put in the objective, and when you do that, the system now becomes fully decomposable. Which means that each customer can solve its own version of the problem, and the coordination and then the convergence towards the solution is then achieved using message exchange between the central coordinator and the customers. So then you formulate the Lagrange dual function, where you minimize over the decision variables of the aggregator and user agents, and then in distributed optimization you solve the Lagrange dual problem, where you also do maximization over Lagrange multipliers lambda. So schematically, how that works, you start with some initial price. So the aggregator then sends this price to all the user agents, and they optimize against that. Price, and they send their power allocation for the next horizon back to the aggregator. Then the aggregator minimizes its own cost function, it updates the price, and then it sends this price back to the customers. They optimize again, and then you repeat that until convergence. So this is essentially price-based coordination, which works fine. The problem is that if the decision, the optimization problem at the customer end includes integer variables, then this becomes a little bit more complicated. It's not included in this explanation, but we discuss that in this paper here at the bottom. Now, the reason why I mentioned that, and this is now the third step of that evolution of DR integration, is to formulate the optimization problem using the optimal power flow, which means that the network constraints are now also explicitly included in the constraints. So note here that I also have decision variables also include network variables. Now, the problem with that is that if you want to solve it using distributed optimization, that doesn't work, because you have this additional coupling through the network. So the way to do that is to duplicate the variables at the intersection between prosumers here at the end and the network. So this power that flows between prosumers and the network, you create two versions of it, you duplicate them, and then you proceed in a similar way as before. You form the Lagrangian, and you also add this penalty term, and this can be solved using ADMM, alternating direction of multiplier method, where you effectively do alternating minimization over network variables and prosumer agent variables by keeping the other copy fixed, and then you also do the price update. So conceptually, it's the same, it's price-based coordination, but because of this additional coupling through the network, you have to use an augmented Lagrangian with this penalty term, and the solution method is ADMM, which has been discussed in the literature quite a bit. So when you do that now, you start with this completely network oblivious system oriented BPP. You can add also customer benefit into the objective. So you get more of a customer focused BPP, but still completely network oblivious. But then if you solve it using OPF, you get something that is not fully customer focused because the system objective or benefit is still explicit in the objective, but now that becomes fully network aware. Now, this approach was actually we trialed that in a recently completed trial on Tasmania, where on Bruny Island. Bruny Island is a small island just off the main coast of Tasmania. It's connected to the mainland with an underwater cable that gets congested during peak time periods, holidays. This is a popular holiday destination. So when people come to the island during holidays, weekends, the consumption increases and that exceeds the capacity of the cable. They have to use diesel. And TAS Networks, the network service provider on Bruny Island, they realized that maybe a better way of doing that is to use PV battery systems owned by customers. And then we trialed this network aware coordination approach in a real world trial where we have 32 PV battery systems scattered across the network. And with that, we were able to reduce the consumption of diesel significantly. Not fully, but we demonstrated that this approach works. And we also proposed nonlinear pricing structures to reward customers for participating in that. Now, maybe just worth mentioning is that when you do this DR coordination, it can happen that you have to curtail PV when the network capacity is exceeded. And that can be an issue because customers who are closer to the substation will be curtailed much less than the customers who are further away from the substation. And it's obviously not fair. So we proposed a version of that network aware DR coordination where you fairly curtail PV. And if you're interested, we recently published a paper. I don't have the time to dwell on that any longer. Okay, so that was so far, you can say that all of what I mentioned is purely academic. By the way, how am I going with the time? I think I have like maybe 10 minutes left. Is that okay?
Yeah, you have like, there's about like 5 to 10 minutes, so we can have some questions at the end.
Okay. So I'll wrap up quickly. Okay, so that's, you can say that all these approaches are academic. Now, if we step back and look where the industry is currently at, and this is from Energy Networks Australia, Open Energy Networks project, and they show this evolution of DR integration from where we are currently at, so self-consumption maximization, static export limits, to a more dynamic export limit. So I'll mention that in a minute. So this is where we are currently at. So this is state of the art. This is probably in a trial phase, so being trialed currently in the network, but they recognize that the future is using full-fledged optimization, which is basically what I described so far. But the industry is currently not at the stage yet where this can be actually done. So I did mention state-of-the-art virtual power plants. This is owned by retailers to minimize exposure in the wholesale market. I mentioned all of that. Now I have a couple of bullet points at the end. So one is from the Australian Energy Market Commission, where they came up with a demand response mechanism rule change. And this is effectively to enable DR to participate in the wholesale market through aggregators. And you have something similar in the US with this FERC order 2222. So they do recognize that DRs can play a much bigger role in the whole system, and we have like policies or rules in place to enable that to happen in the future. So I did mention operating envelope. So this is where the industry is currently, what the industry is currently trialing. The most blunt approach when PV capacity exceeds the hosting capacity of the network is to simply put a blanket constraint on what people can export. That's obviously not optimal. So the industry is now realizing that, and they came up with so-called operating envelopes, where they dynamically adjust the export limit, so that occasionally, when there are no issues, people can export whatever they want. But then when there are issues, they can maybe limit that a little bit more. Now that works fine if you DRs are mostly PV, so passive, but that falls apart when you add batteries on even electric vehicles. Now coming up with principled operating envelopes in such a scenario, you can do that by formulating that as an optimal power flow problem, where you basically maximize the export limit. But the industry is currently not at that stage yet. So at the moment, they are still tinkering around the edges. So they come up with some approximate solutions. And that's possible because most of DR come from PV. There is not much active management, but when all DRs become fully coordinated, fully optimized, then coming up with like approximate operating envelopes will become much more difficult. So in the future, DOs will have to solve some sort of a optimal power flow problem to come with an operating envelopes. Now in the next step, when we come to a fully optimized future, so that's that, where you formulate the problem as an optimal power flow, you basically get operating envelopes as a byproduct. So this is already implicit in the problem formulation. So there is no need to actually do operating envelopes to minimize the network problems. So this is, you can think of that as an intermediate stage. So AEMO, Australian Energy Market Operator, is currently trialing a possible version of the future where they have the distribution system operator responsible for issuing operating envelopes. Here in the middle, we have here we have the energy retailer and the aggregator who aggregates DRs from the owner, and in the middle we have a joint platform managed by AEMO, who actually coordinates all those services coming from DER and the operating envelopes coming from the distribution system operator. So if you're interested, this is now trialed in ARENA. This is Australian Renewable Energy Agency project H. If you Google that, you will find that. And this is from the Open Energy Networks project. Okay, so that's it. So in a conclusion, DR coordination can take many shapes and forms. And if we look at the evolution of DR integration, we can go from hosting capacity management, which is where we are currently at. Peer-to-peer trading can be done, but as I said, I see that to be a bit of a dead end. Then the next step is then start coordinating DRs into virtual power plants. You have to manage distribution networks. And the final stage is a fully optimized DR integration. But we are not quite there yet. Now, there are a couple of open questions which I didn't mention in my presentation. The first one is, how do you actually communicate when we get to that fully optimized future? How to do the coordination between DR agents that requires a communications network with a sufficient bandwidth and low enough latency? That's an open question. Didn't mention that in my presentation. And the second open question is how to reward customers for participating in DRs. This is still doesn't have a solution yet. Most customers are still have a contract with the retailer. Now you might have new players, DR aggregators. Now you have the DSO. So all of that becomes quite convoluted. So coming up with a simple enough reward structure scheme is one one issue that will need to be dealt into the future. Okay, so that's it. I'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for the chat. I think we have the first question, Rodrigo. I don't know if you want to ask your question directly. If anybody else has questions and